Funny how a single empty chair can change an entire life. Rain had been falling over Manhattan since late afternoon, turning sidewalks into shimmering ribbons of silver beneath the glow of streetlights. Yellow taxis crawled through traffic with their headlights reflected across puddles, while hurried pedestrians clutched umbrellas against the steady wind. Grace Bennett pulled her light cardigan tighter around her shoulders, already knowing it would do little against the chilly spring rain. Her white sneakers were damp from walking nearly 6 blocks after finishing an extra shift at the diner, and the paper bag holding tomorrow's lunch was beginning to soften from the moisture. She glanced at the time glowing on the bus stop display. 22 more minutes. She sighed quietly. 22 minutes felt much longer when your feet ached after 10 straight hours of carrying heavy trays and smiling at strangers who rarely remembered your name. A sudden gust of wind pushed Rain sideways, forcing everyone beneath the small shelter to shuffle closer together. Grace noticed a neighborhood coffee shop across the street, its warm amber lights glowing like an invitation. Without thinking twice, she hurried through the crosswalk, laughing softly as rain soaked the ends of her blonde hair. The tiny cafe was crowded with people escaping the weather. The comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee mixed with warm cinnamon and baked pastries wrapped around her the moment she stepped inside. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers while conversations blended into a gentle hum that somehow made everyone feel less alone. Grace paused near the entrance, scanning every occupied table. Students worked on laptops. Couples leaned across tiny wooden tables. An elderly man quietly read a newspaper beside the window. Every seat seemed taken until her eyes landed on one small round table near the back. Only one chair remained empty. Across from it sat a man in his early 30s wearing a charcoal gray jacket over a simple navy sweater. No expensive watch flashed beneath the cafe lights. No designer logo demanded attention. He looked like someone finishing a long workday, quietly stirring a cup of black coffee while reading something on his phone. Grace hesitated for only a second before walking over with an apologetic smile. "Excuse me," she asked, brushing a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "Would you mind if I borrowed this chair? Actually, would you mind if I sat here? Everywhere else is full." The man looked up. His blue eyes carried the calm expression of someone who spent more time listening than speaking. He glanced around the packed cafe before returning a small smile. "Not at all. Please. Thank you," Grace said with obvious relief as she carefully set down her paper bag. "I promise I won't invade your personal space." He chuckled softly. "I think we'll survive." She laughed, the nervous sound surprisingly genuine. "Good. I'd hate to become the weird stranger everyone remembers because she stole someone's table during a rainstorm." "There are worse first impressions," he replied. Grace slipped off her damp cardigan and folded it over the back of her chair. "I'm Grace." He hesitated almost imperceptibly before answering. "Ethan." She extended her hand across the small table. "Nice to meet you, Ethan." He shook it gently. "Likewise." The barista called Grace's order a few moments later. She returned balancing a steaming vanilla latte and a blueberry muffin. As she settled back into her chair, she noticed Ethan had quietly moved his laptop closer to himself, giving her more room without saying a word. It was such a small gesture that most people would never notice. Grace did. "You're considerate," she said before taking her first sip. Ethan looked slightly surprised. "Am I? Most people pretend they don't see anyone else." He glanced around the cafe filled with strangers sharing warmth from the same storm. Maybe everyone just needs a place to sit once in a while. Grace smiled into her coffee. "That's probably the nicest thing I've heard all week." Outside, rain continued tapping gently against the windows, but inside the little cafe, time seemed to slow. Neither of them knew that this ordinary evening would quietly become the beginning of a story neither money nor fate could have planned, all because one crowded coffee shop had only one empty chair. The next morning, Grace almost convinced herself the conversation had simply been one pleasant moment that would disappear into the rhythm of ordinary life. People met strangers in New York every day. They shared elevators, subway seats, coffee shop tables, and sometimes a few polite words before never seeing each other again. That was how the city worked. It kept moving. Yet when she pushed open the glass door of Maple Street Diner at 6:30 in the morning, tied on her apron, and started filling sugar dispensers before the breakfast rush, A small part of her caught itself glancing toward the entrance every few minutes. She laughed quietly at herself. It was ridiculous. She barely knew the man beyond his first name and kind eyes. By 8:15, the diner buzzed with regular customers ordering pancakes, scrambled eggs, and endless cups of coffee. The bell above the entrance chimed again. Grace looked up automatically. Ethan stepped inside carrying a folded navy umbrella, his hair still damp from the light morning drizzle. Unlike many customers dressed in expensive suits, he wore simple dark jeans, clean sneakers, and a light gray jacket that blended perfectly into the crowd. If someone had asked Grace to guess his profession, she would have said architect, engineer, or maybe an accountant. Certainly not someone extraordinary. He noticed her almost immediately and smiled with genuine surprise. "Looks like we keep running into each other," he said as she approached with a menu even though they both knew he did not need one. "Either New York is much smaller than everyone says," Grace replied with a grin, "or you have excellent timing. Maybe a little of both." She poured fresh coffee into the ceramic mug in front of him. "What can I get you?" "Whatever you recommend." Grace pretended to think very seriously. "That is a dangerous amount of trust for someone you met yesterday. I have a feeling your recommendations are reliable." She laughed softly. "In that case, blueberry pancakes. They are the only reason some people wake up before 9. "Then blueberry pancakes it is." As she walked away, Ethan found himself watching the easy way she greeted every customer by name whenever she could remember it. She asked about a retired teacher's grandson. She reminded another customer to take his umbrella because more rain was expected later. None of it felt forced. Kindness simply seemed to be her natural language. During a quieter moment, Grace returned with his breakfast. "So," she asked while refilling his coffee, "what exactly do you do?" Ethan looked at the steam rising from the mug before answering. "I solve problems." She tilted her head with an amused smile. "That sounds mysterious." "It is less exciting than it sounds." "Come on," she teased. "Lawyer? Engineer? Secret government agent?" He chuckled. "Definitely not the last one." "Then what kind of problems?" "Business problems. Numbers. Decisions. People needing answers." Grace nodded slowly. "That still sounds vague. Maybe I have had too much practice explaining my job without putting people to sleep." She smiled. "Fair enough. I wait tables, so I probably cannot judge." Ethan looked at her more carefully. "Is this what you always wanted to do?" She rested the coffee pot lightly against her hip. "Not exactly. It pays the bills. Someday I would like to own a little bakery with a reading corner. Fresh bread, good coffee, shelves full of books, and absolutely no loud music." "That sounds nice." "It sounds expensive," she corrected with a playful sigh. "Dreams usually are." Before he could answer, another customer waved for assistance. "Duty calls," Grace said. "Do not let your pancakes get cold." Ethan watched her hurry across the diner with the same warm smile she offered everyone. For the first time in months, the endless meetings waiting on his calendar no longer seemed like the most important part of his day. And without realizing it, both of them quietly began hoping that tomorrow morning would feel exactly like today. The day slipped quietly into a rhythm neither Grace nor Ethan had planned, yet both of them began to rely on it more than they cared to admit. Every weekday, just before 8 o'clock, the bell above the diner's front door chimed, and Ethan walked in carrying the same navy umbrella if rain threatened, or simply a folded newspaper if the morning was bright. He always chose the booth beside the front window, where sunlight spilled across the table whenever the clouds allowed it. Before he even sat down, Grace already had a fresh cup of black coffee waiting. She never asked if he wanted cream or sugar because after the third visit, she had learned he preferred neither. Ethan noticed that small detail immediately, but he never mentioned it. Instead, he simply smiled every time she placed the mug in front of him. One Tuesday morning, she set the coffee down with a playful grin. "You are becoming predictable." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" "For a regular customer, absolutely. You even arrive within the same 3-minute window every day." "That sounds slightly concerning." She laughed. "Do not worry. I only notice because my breakfast rush follows a pattern too." He looked around the diner. The elderly couple always shared one stack of pancakes. The young police officer always ordered oatmeal before his shift. A college student always sat near the electrical outlet with textbooks spread across the table. Somehow Grace remembered everyone's habits without making any of it feel routine. She made each customer feel as though they mattered. While Ethan finished breakfast, he noticed her helping an older woman gather groceries after one of the bags unexpectedly split near the entrance. Grace knelt without hesitation, collecting apples that rolled across the floor while reassuring the embarrassed customer that accidents happen to everyone. A few minutes later, she returned to Ethan's table, slightly out of breath but still smiling. "Sorry about that." "You apologized too much," Ethan replied. "Occupational hazard. Or maybe kindness." Grace shrugged as though it were nothing important. "People have enough difficult moments already. If I can make one of them a little easier, why not?" Her words stayed with Ethan long after he left the diner. At the office, executives debated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Presentations filled conference room screens, and assistants hurried between meetings carrying tablets and folders. Ethan answered questions, approved budgets, and listened carefully as department heads discussed expansion plans. Yet somewhere between quarterly projections and investment reports, his thoughts drifted back to a waitress who believed picking up someone's spilled groceries deserved no recognition at all. The following morning, Grace noticed something unusual beneath Ethan's coffee mug as she cleared the table. Resting on the saucer was a shiny silver coin instead of the usual tip. Curious, she picked it up and discovered a tiny four-leaf clover engraved on one side. Ethan looked up from his newspaper. "My grandfather used to carry one just like it," he explained. "He always said it reminded him that luck usually begins with gratitude." Grace turned the coin over in her fingers before handing it back. "Sounds like your grandfather was a wise man." Ethan gently pushed it toward her instead. "Keep it until tomorrow." She blinked in surprise. "Why?" "Consider it a challenge." "A challenge? Bring it back tomorrow. If you do, I will know you believe small things matter." Grace laughed softly. "That is an unusual test." "Maybe. What if I lose it? Then I will know life happened." She slipped the coin carefully into the small pocket of her apron. "Do not worry. I am surprisingly good at protecting important things." The next morning, before Ethan even reached his usual booth, Grace held up the silver coin with a triumphant smile. "Mission accomplished." Ethan accepted it with quiet satisfaction. "I never doubted you." "You should have. My coworker almost borrowed my apron yesterday." "But she did not." Grace shook her head. "Because I told her I was protecting someone's lucky coin." They both laughed, unaware that what had started as a simple game was quietly becoming a tradition. Neither of them realized the little silver coin would someday carry far more meaning than either of them could possibly imagine. Just as neither of them noticed how every ordinary morning together was slowly building something neither wealth nor coincidence alone could ever create. Saturday arrived wrapped in clear blue skies, and for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither Grace nor Ethan had anywhere they absolutely had to be before noon. Grace had just finished her short morning shift when she stepped outside the diner carrying a small paper bag with 2 fresh cinnamon rolls that had not sold during breakfast. She almost smiled before even looking up because Ethan was already standing across the street, hands tucked into his jacket pockets as though he had been debating whether to come inside. When their eyes met, he crossed the sidewalk with an almost sheepish expression. "You look like someone waiting for a friend," Grace teased. "Maybe I was." "Well, your friend just finished work." She held up the paper bag. "I rescued these from becoming tomorrow's leftovers." Ethan laughed. "That sounds like a tragedy successfully avoided." They began walking without deciding on a destination. The city felt different on weekends. Office buildings no longer emptied streams of hurried professionals onto every corner. Street musicians filled the sidewalks with familiar melodies. Children chased soap bubbles in the small plaza, and local artists displayed paintings beneath colorful tents. Grace slowed near one booth covered with watercolor landscapes. "I always stop here," she admitted. "I cannot afford to buy anything yet, but looking is free." Ethan studied the paintings before looking at her. "Which one would you choose if money did not matter?" She pointed toward a simple canvas showing a quiet bakery on a rainy afternoon with warm light glowing through the windows. "That one. Because it is beautiful." Grace shook her head. "Because it feels like home, even though I have never been there." Ethan found himself smiling at the answer. Most people would have chosen the largest or most expensive painting. Grace chose the one that reminded her of a dream. They continued walking until they reached a weekend farmer's market where the smell of fresh bread drifted through the air. Grace stopped at nearly every stand, greeting vendors she recognized from years of passing through the neighborhood. She introduced Ethan to an elderly couple who sold homemade jam every Saturday. "This is Ethan," she said naturally, as though introducing an old friend instead of someone she had only known for a short time. "He solves problems." Ethan laughed quietly. "I suppose that has become my official job description." The elderly woman smiled warmly. "Everyone needs someone who solves problems." Grace winked. "See? It works." Around lunchtime, they bought hot dogs from a street cart and carried them to a nearby park overlooking the river. They found an empty bench beneath a large maple tree where a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass through the warm afternoon air. For several peaceful minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply watched sailboats move slowly across the water while joggers and families passed by. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course. Do you ever feel like everyone is always rushing towards something they forget to enjoy where they already are?" He considered her question carefully. "More often than I would like to admit." She looked out toward the river again. "I think people believe happiness only starts after the next promotion, the next paycheck, or the next big opportunity. I keep telling myself I should enjoy today too." Ethan lowered his gaze to the silver coin resting in his palm, the same one he had absent-mindedly carried with him again that morning. "My grandfather used to say success means very little if you never stop long enough to notice who is walking beside you." Grace smiled gently. "I think your grandfather and my grandmother would have gotten along." As the afternoon sun drifted lower, they slowly made their way back toward the neighborhood where the diner stood. Neither of them noticed how naturally their footsteps had fallen into the same rhythm. When they reached the corner where their paths separated, Grace smiled. "Thank you for spending your Saturday with me." Ethan returned the smile without hesitation. "Thank you for reminding me what a Saturday is supposed to feel like." She waved before turning toward her apartment, while Ethan remained standing for another moment, quietly watching her disappear into the evening crowd. For the first time in years, a free afternoon felt more valuable than any meeting on his calendar, and neither of them realized that the ordinary memories they were creating together would soon be tested by a truth that had remained carefully hidden from the very beginning. Monday morning arrived with bright sunshine reflecting off the glass towers of Midtown, making the city seem lighter than it had in weeks. Grace had barely finished arranging fresh coffee mugs behind the counter when the familiar bell above the diner's entrance rang. Without looking up, she smiled to herself. Somehow she already knew who it would be. "Good morning, Ethan," she called as she reached for the coffee pot. "You are getting predictable again." "I was afraid you might say that," he answered with an easy grin as he settled into his usual booth beside the window. "Should I start arriving at random hours?" "Please do not. You would ruin my schedule." She placed his black coffee in front of him before he even asked. "You remember everything," Ethan observed. "Only the important things." Before he could reply, his phone vibrated across the table. The screen briefly lit up with a dozen notifications before he quietly turned it face down. Grace noticed only a glimpse of several missed calls and an email marked urgent. "Busy morning?" she asked. "Something like that. You know, most people would answer." Ethan wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug instead. "Sometimes the world can wait 5 more minutes." Grace smiled without realizing how unusual that answer truly was. Across town, however, the world was definitely not waiting. Inside the top-floor conference room of Walker Dynamics, executives exchanged concerned glances while Ethan's executive assistant, Claire Sullivan, checked her watch for the 3rd time. "Has anyone heard from Mr. Walker?" one board member asked. Claire maintained her professional composure even though she knew exactly where he probably was. "He will arrive shortly," she answered. "He always does." Nearly 40 minutes later, Ethan finally stepped into the conference room, carrying nothing more than a paper coffee cup and a thoughtful expression. Several executives immediately stood. "Good morning, everyone," he said calmly. "Let us begin." No one mentioned his lateness, but Claire noticed something different. For years, Ethan had walked into meetings already thinking about numbers, acquisitions, and deadlines. Today, he seemed unusually relaxed, almost happy. As the meeting ended, Claire caught up with him outside his office. "You have been visiting the same neighborhood every morning." Ethan glanced toward the city skyline beyond the windows. "Have I?" "Your driver certainly has." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I like the coffee." Claire folded her arms with playful skepticism. You own an espresso machine that costs more than my first car. Ethan laughed quietly, but offered no explanation. Meanwhile, Grace finished her afternoon shift and decided to walk home instead of taking the bus. The weather was too beautiful to waste underground. As she turned onto Lexington Avenue, traffic slowed unexpectedly near the curb. A long black limousine eased to a stop beside a modern office tower across the street. Grace barely paid attention until she noticed a familiar navy umbrella resting inside the open rear door. Her steps slowed. For a brief second, she caught sight of someone stepping from the vehicle wearing a charcoal gray jacket remarkably similar to Ethan's. Before she could focus, several professionally dressed employees surrounded the man, and the revolving doors swallowed the entire group into the building. Grace frowned slightly. That looked a little like Ethan, she whispered to herself before immediately shaking her head. Impossible. Ethan had told her he solved business problems. Plenty of people worked in offices. Plenty of people carried navy umbrellas. New York was full of coincidences. Smiling at her own imagination, she continued walking. Across the street, Claire happened to glance back through the revolving doors just in time to see Grace disappearing into the afternoon crowd. Who was she? Claire asked quietly as they entered the elevator. Ethan looked toward the street for only a moment before the doors closed. A friend. Claire nodded, but noticed the softness in his voice. She had worked beside Ethan for nearly 7 years and had never heard him describe anyone quite that way. Back at the diner the following morning, Grace found herself telling her coworker Mia about the strange coincidence. I almost thought I saw Ethan getting out of a limousine yesterday, she admitted while arranging fresh pastries. Mia laughed. Maybe your mystery businessman has been hiding something. Grace smiled as she shook her head. No, Ethan is just Ethan. Yet somewhere deep inside her, a tiny question quietly lingered. While across the city another morning of hidden truths moved one step closer to being impossible to keep concealed. Friday evening arrived wrapped in golden light as Grace hurried through the employee entrance of the Grand Lexington Hotel, smoothing the front of her freshly pressed uniform. Her diner manager had volunteered several staff members to help serve a charity gala, promising the extra hours would come with generous pay. Grace gladly accepted. Rent was due next week, and every additional dollar mattered. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while elegant centerpieces covered every table with white roses and candlelight. Guests in tailored suits and evening gowns greeted one another with effortless confidence. Grace quietly reminded herself to stay focused. Tonight she was simply here to do her job well. The banquet captain gathered the service team for final instructions. Our guest of honor will arrive shortly, he announced. This event supports educational scholarships across New York, so professionalism is essential. Once the keynote speaker is introduced, all service pauses until the presentation ends. Grace nodded along with everyone else before picking up a silver tray filled with sparkling water glasses. As the ballroom slowly filled, she moved gracefully between tables, smiling politely while refilling glasses and answering simple requests. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet strangely beautiful. She had never been inside a room like this except in movies. Across the ballroom, Claire Sullivan adjusted the evening schedule while speaking quietly into her headset. She glanced toward the entrance every few moments, waiting for one particular arrival. Outside the hotel, a familiar black limousine rolled beneath the covered entrance. Ethan stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Camera flashes immediately illuminated the sidewalk as photographers called his name. He acknowledged them with a courteous smile before entering the hotel. Good evening, Mr. Walker. Several staff members greeted almost simultaneously. Ethan thanked each of them before following Claire toward the ballroom. Everything is ready, Claire said softly. Ethan nodded but looked unusually distracted. Has the scholarship committee arrived? Yes. Good. He hesitated before asking another question. Are all the catering staff local? Claire looked at him curiously. I believe so. What? Ethan simply shook his head. No reason. Moments later, inside the ballroom, Grace carried another tray toward the back of the room when applause suddenly erupted near the entrance. Curious, she glanced over her shoulder. She froze. The man walking confidently beside the event organizers looked unmistakably familiar. The same calm blue eyes. The same gentle smile. The same person who drank black coffee every morning at her diner. Ethan. Her heart skipped so suddenly that she nearly forgot to breathe. Before she could make sense of what she was seeing, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight in support of educational opportunity across our city. It is my great honor to welcome the founder and chairman of Walker Dynamics, one of the youngest philanthropists and business leaders in America. Please join me in welcoming billionaire Ethan Walker. The room exploded into applause. Hundreds of guests rose to their feet. Grace stood perfectly still as the words echoed through the ballroom. Billionaire, chairman, Walker Dynamics. Every vague answer he had ever given suddenly rushed back into her memory. I solve problems. Business problems. Numbers. Decisions. She had thought he was being modest. He had been hiding an entirely different life. Ethan walked onto the stage with calm confidence, thanking the audience before beginning his remarks about opportunity, education, and giving people a chance to build better futures. His voice remained steady, but as his eyes scanned the ballroom, they unexpectedly found Grace standing near the back. For one brief moment, everything else disappeared. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Ethan immediately recognized the shock written across her face. Grace looked down at the silver tray trembling slightly in her hands before carefully setting it onto a nearby service station. She could barely hear the speech anymore. Every conversation they had shared inside the diner replayed inside her mind with painful clarity. Every morning coffee, every walk, every laugh, every unanswered question. She quietly stepped away from the ballroom doors and into the silent hallway outside, trying to steady her breathing. She had believed she knew Ethan. Now she was no longer certain she had ever known him at all. Inside the ballroom, Ethan finished one sentence before pausing almost imperceptibly, realizing the one person whose opinion mattered most had just walked away. Grace did not remember how she reached the employee hallway. The cheerful music from the ballroom faded behind the heavy doors until only the quiet hum of the hotel's air conditioning remained. She rested one hand against the wall and closed her eyes, trying to steady the storm of emotions racing through her mind. Billionaire, chairman, Walker Dynamics. The words refused to disappear. Every simple conversation they had shared suddenly carried a different meaning. Every time she had asked about his work, he had answered with just enough truth to avoid telling the whole story. She whispered to herself, "Who are you really, Ethan?" Back inside the ballroom, Ethan finished his speech to another standing ovation, but for the first time in years, applause sounded strangely distant. As soon as the final photograph was taken, he handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies and quietly turned to Claire. "Please handle the rest of the reception." Claire studied his expression with concern. "Is everything all right?" Ethan glanced toward the ballroom entrance where Grace had disappeared moments earlier. Not even close. Without another word, he walked quickly through the side corridor until he finally spotted Grace standing beside a tall window overlooking the city lights. She heard his footsteps but did not turn around. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Rain had begun again outside, tiny drops tracing silver lines across the glass. Ethan stopped a respectful distance behind her. "Grace." His voice was gentle, almost uncertain. She slowly faced him. Her eyes were calm, but the warmth he had grown accustomed to seeing there was gone. "So this is who you are?" Ethan nodded quietly. "Yes." She let out a small breath that sounded more disappointed than angry. "No. This is who you never told me you were." He lowered his eyes for a moment. "You are right." Grace folded her arms, searching his face as though hoping to find the man she had spent so many mornings laughing with over coffee. "Every day I asked questions because I wanted to know you better. Every day you answered just enough to make me stop asking. I never lied to you. Maybe not with your words." Her voice remained soft, which somehow hurt even more. "But you let me believe something that was never true." Ethan took one careful step closer. "I wanted you to know me before you knew my last name." Grace looked at him in disbelief. "Did you ever think I deserved the choice to decide that for myself?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Ethan had no answer. She continued quietly. "Do you know what hurts the most? It is not that you are wealthy. It is that every memory I have from these past weeks now comes with another question. Was any of it real?" "Every moment was real," Ethan answered immediately. "Every breakfast, every walk, every conversation. I looked forward to all of them." Grace searched his face again, wanting desperately to believe him, yet unable to silence the doubt growing inside her. You could have told me after the first week. He nodded. I know. You could have trusted me. I was afraid. She frowned slightly. Afraid of what? Ethan looked toward the rain outside before answering honestly. Afraid that once people discover who I am, they stop seeing me. They start seeing my money, my company, my influence. With you, I finally felt ordinary. Grace's expression softened for only a heartbeat before sadness returned. And I thought you trusted me enough to be yourself. The silence between them stretched painfully. Finally, Grace reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small silver coin with the engraved four-leaf clover. She gently placed it into Ethan's hand. You told me small things matter. Ethan closed his fingers around the coin without looking away from her. They do. Then maybe you should have remembered that honesty is one of the smallest things that matters the most. Tears threatened to form in her eyes, but she blinked them away before they could fall. Please do not come to the diner tomorrow. Ethan's heart sank. Grace. She slowly shook her head. I need time to remember which parts of the man I met were real and which parts were carefully hidden. Without another word, she turned and walked down the quiet hallway, leaving Ethan standing alone beside the rain-covered window with nothing in his hand except a small silver coin that suddenly felt heavier than everything he had ever built. The next morning, the booth beside the front window remained empty for the first time since Ethan had become part of Grace's routine. She noticed it immediately, even though she had promised herself she would not look. Every time the bell above the diner door chimed, her eyes lifted instinctively before she reminded herself why she should stop hoping. Customers came and went, coffee cups were refilled, pancakes disappeared from plates, and conversations filled the room just as they always had. Yet something invisible had changed. Even her coworker Mia noticed. Your regular friend is missing today, she said quietly while drying a stack of dishes. Grace forced a small smile. People get busy. Maybe. Mia looked at her carefully. Or maybe people make mistakes. Grace did not answer. Across the city, Ethan stood inside his office looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The conference table behind him was filled with reports waiting for signatures, yet he had not touched a single page. The small silver coin rested in the palm of his hand. He turned it over slowly, reading the tiny engraved four-leaf clover again and again. Claire knocked gently before entering. The board is ready for the acquisition meeting. Ethan remained silent for a moment before speaking. Reschedule it. Claire blinked in surprise. It took 3 months to arrange. Then they can wait one more day. She had worked beside him long enough to recognize when a decision had already been made. You are going to see Grace. Ethan nodded, not to convince her that I deserve forgiveness. He closed his fingers around the coin, only to finally tell her everything I should have said from the beginning. That afternoon, heavy gray clouds gathered once again above the city. Ethan left his office without security, without his driver, and without the black limousine that usually followed him everywhere. Instead, he carried only the familiar navy umbrella as light rain began to fall. When he reached Maple Street Diner, he stopped across the street instead of walking inside. Through the large front window, he could see Grace laughing politely with customers while pouring fresh coffee, but every now and then her smile quietly faded whenever she believed no one was watching. Ethan remained where he was. He remembered her final request. Please do not come to the diner tomorrow. He intended to honor those words. So he waited outside. 1 hour passed. Then another. Rain slowly soaked the sidewalks while evening settled over the neighborhood. Several customers noticed the man standing patiently beneath the navy umbrella, but none of them recognized him. Grace finally finished her shift shortly after 6 o'clock. She pushed open the diner's front door and immediately saw Ethan waiting across the street. He did not wave. He did not walk toward her. He simply stood there, giving her the choice she had asked for days earlier. Grace hesitated before crossing the street. You listened, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. You asked me not to come inside. Yet you waited anyway. I was hoping you might decide to speak with me. They began walking slowly through the gentle rain without choosing a destination. After several blocks, Ethan finally broke the silence. When I was 27, an investor told me something I never forgot. He said that after enough success, people stop telling you the truth because they become afraid of disappointing you. Grace listened without interrupting. I hated that feeling, Ethan continued. So I started introducing myself without my last name whenever I could. Sometimes people treated me normally. Sometimes they did not. But with you, he smiled sadly. You never cared about any title because you never knew one existed. Grace looked down at the rain splashing softly around their feet. You still made the decision for both of us. I did. Ethan did not try to defend himself. And I was wrong. They stopped beside the same small coffee shop where they had first shared the only empty table weeks earlier. Warm lights still glowed through the windows despite the rain outside. Ethan carefully opened his hand and offered Grace the silver coin once again. I kept thinking about what you said. Honesty really is one of the smallest things that matters the most. I cannot change the beginning of our story, but I refuse to hide any part of myself from this moment forward. Whether you walk away tonight or stay, you will never have to wonder again who I am. Grace looked at the familiar coin resting in his palm, then at the quiet sincerity in his eyes. For the first time since the gala, she no longer saw a billionaire standing before her. She simply saw a man who had finally chosen complete truth over comfortable silence. Several weeks passed, not with dramatic promises or impossible miracles, but with quiet consistency. Ethan never tried to impress Grace with expensive gifts or grand displays of wealth. Instead, he kept every small promise he made. He answered every difficult question honestly, even when the answers were uncomfortable. If he was delayed because of a board meeting, he said so. If he needed to travel for business, he told her where he was going and why. Slowly, the uncertainty that had settled between them began to fade. Grace also discovered parts of Ethan's world that no newspaper ever mentioned. She visited the scholarship foundation he had quietly funded for years and met students whose lives had changed because someone they had never met believed in their future. She watched Ethan spend an entire afternoon listening to young entrepreneurs without once mentioning his own success. The man she had known over coffee had not disappeared inside the billionaire. He had simply carried responsibilities she had never imagined. One Saturday morning, Ethan invited Grace to see a property just a few blocks from the neighborhood where they first met. The building was old but full of character, with large windows facing the street and enough space for both a bakery and a small reading corner. Grace stepped inside and slowly turned in a circle, her eyes growing wider with every step. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "I thought you might say that." She looked at him cautiously. "Are you buying this for me?" He immediately shook his head. "No." He handed her a folder instead. "I asked a business consultant to help prepare a financing plan. If you still want your dream, I will invest as your business partner. You will own the majority of the company. You will make every decision. If you decide the answer is no, nothing changes between us." Grace looked through the documents in disbelief. There were no hidden conditions, no complicated clauses, only a fair partnership built on respect instead of dependence. She smiled through grateful tears. "You remembered everything." Ethan laughed softly. "You once told me dreams are expensive. I figured they deserved a proper business plan." Over the following months, the little bakery slowly came to life. Fresh bread filled the neighborhood with warm aromas every morning. Comfortable chairs surrounded shelves of donated books, and a small handwritten sign near the entrance simply read, "Welcome." Regular customers quickly discovered that the owners greeted everyone with the same kindness whether they ordered a single cup of coffee or an entire birthday cake. One afternoon, Grace noticed something hanging on the wall near the front window. Inside a simple wooden frame rested a silver coin engraved with a tiny four-leaf clover. Beneath it was a small plaque that read, "Small things matter because they become the beginning of great stories." Grace smiled as she gently touched the glass. Exactly 1 year after they had first shared the only empty chair inside a crowded coffee shop, Ethan asked Grace to meet him there once more. Very little had changed. Soft jazz still floated through the air. The smell of fresh coffee still welcomed every customer. Even the same small round table stood quietly near the back of the room. This time no one else needed the empty chair. Ethan stood as Grace approached. "Do you remember what you asked me the first day we met?" She laughed softly. "I asked if I could sit here." "You did." He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed the silver coin on the table between them. Then he took a small velvet box from his other pocket, opening it with calm confidence rather than nervous spectacle. "One empty chair gave me the greatest gift I never expected. You taught me that trust cannot be purchased, honesty cannot be postponed, and love grows strongest in ordinary moments. Grace Bennett, would you spend the rest of your life filling every empty chair beside me? Tears filled Grace's eyes as she nodded before she could even find the words. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. The quiet applause from nearby customers felt warmer than any ballroom celebration. Months later, their wedding was held in a peaceful garden surrounded by family, close friends, co-workers from the diner, employees from Walker Dynamics, and students whose scholarships had opened new doors. There were no extravagant displays meant to impress the world, only laughter, grateful hearts, and two people who had learned that the greatest distance was never between wealth and simplicity, but between secrecy and trust. As evening settled and the lights softly illuminated the celebration, the navy umbrella rested near the entrance. The silver coin remained carefully framed inside the bakery, and somewhere in the city, a single empty chair waited for the next ordinary moment that might quietly change another life forever.